talking about Palm Sunday being also the Sunday of the Passion. Was there anything of it? I'm just kind of curious because I know that's one that sometimes you're seeing that really dual image. And I know we talked a little bit, but I don't know if I really gave you a chance to see what your thoughts are. If you
in with a donkey, is that where he comes? Jesus is
Yeah, he comes in on a donkey
that.
into Jerusalem. And it's basically their garments. Only one of the gospel actually says palm branches. The others just say they laid branches. So who knows? I don't know what else they're growing. I don't think they had pine trees.
There's always a question of what kind of palm. And I heard reading an article years ago. There was apparently some community down in South America somewhere where it had become traditional to use a specific kind of palm tree, but that particular palm was the nesting tree of some tropical bird that was endangered. So it was kind of this whole, okay, we've got to stop using this tree, but apparently the local traditions had ascribed a lot of supernatural powers to the palm trees that people would bring home for the worship services, and people weren't certain that they were the real thing if you used a different species of tree, and so trying to get everyone to use a different palm tree was like this big deal. And I was like, and I just always heard like, okay, it's a palm, but apparently some people it's like this big deal, and that's tied into their local landscape of how
It's
they
kind of
interpret
like
the palm.
Episcopalians and altar guilds of like if you use red wine, all of a sudden if you brought white wine,
Oh yeah.
and they're like, oh no. And I'm going like, it doesn't stain. They're like, oh, maybe it's not. But because that's I've seen congregations like where they've tried using the white port, and people are like, it's not. It's not the real, it's still because it just says wine, Jesus used wine. It didn't say what kind. I don't think he probably had, a Gewürztraminer or anything like that. I'm sure that, I don't know, I have a feeling that wine probably wasn't that great back then, but I don't know. Might be better than you thought.
Who knows? It, it depends on probably how much money you had to spend on it.
No, that's true.
Now,
That is
for
true.
Palm Sunday, red is the color.
That's right.
Why is it red?
Because we say so.
I just wondered if there was a rationale for it.
Well, the red is also used on Good Friday. Now, in a much reduced way, usually just a stole, or if you have a simple thing with kind of red or unbleached linen. And the red also signifies sacrifice and kind of blood and all this. And what you get, of course, and this is what's hard for some people, is that switch you're going, oh, glory, love, and honor. You're like, yay, Jesus. You're doing all this. You're coming in triumphantly, and then all of a sudden, boom, he's on trial. All of a sudden, the same crowd's yelling, crucify, and you're like, and all that happens like within 10 minutes of the worship service, so you speed through. It's like, it's odd in some ways, and I know some people there's one of the members here who told me, I absolutely hate that Sunday. And I said, tell me about it. Tell me why. I don't lie. And it's basically that it's Palm Sunday. And then all of a sudden, we feel like we sped ahead to Good Friday. Well, and of course, part of that is that's why they also call it the Sunday of the Passion. Because you then have the long Passion reading, which is very similar to the one you get on Good Friday. It does a couple of things to show he enters in triumph, but how quickly people can turn on you if you don't give them what they think they want. When he made it clear he wasn't going to be a military and try to overthrow Rome, they're like, yeah, whatever, give us Barabbas. There was this whole thing, and Jesus kind of knew this, was preparing his disciples loved Palm Sunday. Because it's like, we're his disciples. We're the one, they, thought this was great. And of course, Jesus kept preparing them and saying, no, this is not going to be like that. And one of the symbolisms of he doesn't, if you notice, he does not ride in on a horse. He rides in on a donkey or a colt, you know. And so there's this real symbol of, even in the midst of this, of humility, but there's also that part where Jesus acknowledges the people's need to have a reason for hope and celebration. Because remember when they say, tell your disciples and the people to stop, the Pharisees, and he said no, because if I don't, the very rocks will cry out. Mm-hmm. And it means creation is crying out for being made new life. But what we then, and it's uncomfortable it's uncomfortable. There's one time I did ask my bishop years ago, I said, can I just do Palm Sunday without the Passion? He goes, no. I'm like, shoot.
You knew that was coming.
You know, and then some people think it's also thrown in there because modern Christians tend to, a little less in Western society, observe the participation of the holy days like they used to. And so they're kind of saying, if you go from Palm Sunday to Easter, you don't have a clue what happened. So they think that was, and actually in some several hundred years ago, in a lot of the historic churches, this Sunday, the fifth Sunday in Lent, was called the Passion Sunday to get you ready for Holy Week. And it was like saying, okay, here's the focus. Here's where it all went down. It got moved in with Palm Sunday to try to bookcase, in a sense, that week. But I always just say it's kind of a schizophrenic service, you know? I mean, it's just...
You know, in the past we've processed outside. Are we doing that this year?
It all depends on the weather. And
we had a trumpeter too.
Yeah. Now, see, if you're going outside and doing it, it's kind of a real letdown if you're just kind of walking in silence. I mean, it kind of has a sense of that. If you have someone to lead, like something, a singing or a chanting or something like that, it works a lot better. Last year, what we did, and I mean, I got a lot of comments that people said, that was fine, it was good. We met, all gathered in the narthex. Yeah. And then we blessed the palms, and people got their palms, and then processed into the church then at that point. As they're playing the big hymn, the All Glory, Lord, and then when you all get to your seat, they introduce it, and we all start singing it together. Because one of the problems is when you're walking too, if you have a long line, somebody's singing here and somebody's singing here, they're going to be like two measures different here. They're going, Hosanna, Hosanna. It's if you have someone who's good at leading, it works great.
I presume that's why we had somebody playing the trumpet.
Yes, exactly.
So
You're correct. That kind of, even if you don't sing, at least having that, because you want to experience, if you're doing that, something as we imagine would have been like on that day. And I have to admit, I think almost though the transition happens too quickly in some ways in the service. But I mean, we all like, I think most people all like the Palm Sunday part. I mean, it's great. It's a celebration, and it's just hard. Like some people will avoid Good Friday, and they'll say, "Well, I know what it is, but it's just too hard to go through." Because what we do in our worship on Good Friday is not just tell a story. You are part of that story. We walk that. And that's hard for some people when the people actually, because there's the parts in there on Good Friday, the very height of that service. We are the ones going, crucify him, crucify him.
Because I won't do that.
Oh, really?
I've always refused to participate in that little section of it. And I'm like,
that's
why
fine.
don't they just narrate that? Because any good Christian, it should hurt our hearts to even have those words cross our lips, and I find it really troubling.
I think it's kind of this back and forth with, if you have it just narrated, it's very possible to have the service feed anti-Semitic elements in the church community.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas if you have it be, no, we are, trying to be a modern day adopted branch of the house of Israel, shall we say, that we are the inheritors of this, ourselves, rather than this other group somewhere else, and that we can recognize that we are complicit with the evil in the world rather than it being separate from us. But at the same time, yeah, it is harsh.
That's why I don't want to be complicit with that part of the world.
Yeah, and I think that it's good to feel that tension, because I think it's supposed to evoke that.
I think both. What you're saying, it's a both end. And I remember the very first time I did it, I was like, no. I was like, oh, and it just shocked me. And then over time now, I respect what you're saying, and that's perfectly fine. There's not a right and wrong on that.
Mm-hmm.
But
So I can just keep coming to church.
well, I guess I'll let you. Okay. But for me, I've kind of learned that I even myself, I can think, oh, well, I'm an ordained priest of the church. Well, in our daily lives, and it doesn't mean that we literally go, Jesus, I hate you, I croak you, but there's things in the world that if we embrace the crowd, the world always will reject Jesus. I mean, this kind of gets some deep theological, but in the sense, what Jesus says is threatening not only to the religious, but it's a threat to the empire and any empire of the world. And we're all part of both the religious people and the empire ourselves. And there's something about saying, we have to think about this. If you were there that day and you don't know anything we know today, would you have possibly said, crucify him? Now, it's hard to do that from our perspective. But to think in that day, these were people who were out there, Hosanna! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. These are the same people who were so excited for Jesus, but our fickleness and how we can be changed so quickly. I mean, we all know the most difficult thing we probably experience in our life in some form or fashion, and it depends on where it is, but is a sense of betrayal.
Yeah.
That cuts to the heart, the bone. And in a sense, I participate with the crowd because I go, Lord, in some ways, by what I've either done or left undone, sometimes I may not say it, but I mean basically crucify, get rid of him. I don't want to deal with what Jesus tells us to do. Now, that's hard, but it's just kind of where I am now.
Because every time I've heard the story, I never once thought that the same people that were saying Hosanna during the Palm narrative were the same people who the next day, I feared it was two factions, because there were two factions. And as far as anti-Semitism goes, all those people waving the palms and saying Hosanna, they were all Jews too.
Mm-hmm.
And yet there were bad Jews. So to me, it's like January 6th. It's like you look at Washington, D.C. on January 6th and you think all Americans are pure evil and horrible and haters. I think it was just a changing of the guard in that short space of time, and the hateful Jewish people who saw Jesus as a threat were the ones carrying out the last half, but his followers and a lot of kind of innocent bystanders probably got caught up in it. I think the spirit was probably in the air that day, and the good people who didn't know much about it probably got caught up and were like, wow, is this really the Messiah? How cool was that? So I hope there weren't flip-floppers that would do that big of a flip-flop in that short of a space of time, but I guess it could be, but I've never envisioned it that way at
And
all.
I have a real sensitivity about this thing about because John will always use the word "and the Jews," and he's talking about it from his perspective as a Jew himself.
Yeah.
But when we read it today, it sounds like we're blaming the Jews for crucifying Jesus. But that is not
I never
that.
thought that.
Yeah, well, there's people get very so. For me, when it says "and the Jews said this," well, it was the people. It just meant that was the people, because you're in Jerusalem, they're Jews. It's not in Caesarea Philippi. I mean.
But it was the top Pharisees.
Yeah,
It wasn't
and what
necessarily-
happens is, you know, when he comes in first, and I think there are people who probably, you know, Jerusalem at that time and all of Judea needed a reason to celebrate. I mean, they were under massive thumb oppression of the Romans. And so to see this, God, I could easily get caught up in that, like, yeah, thank God somebody's bringing us good news. What happens, interestingly, is this whole betrayal thing with Judas and then with the religious leaders. It's not with the Romans.
Right.
It's his own people, his religious authorities, some who had respected and liked him, but said, you know, he's gone too far. And then when he makes it clear that his kingdom is not of this world, they kind of flip out because it's like, well, he's not even going to offer us maybe to lead a revolt. I mean, that's like, so imagine if, I don't know, trying to make an analogy here, but say the presiding bishop of the United States comes in and says these things and at General Convention of the whole Episcopal Church, and we're all excited, and then he says, well, no, God's calling us to do this instead. And us all betraying and saying, no, remove that guy, get rid of him, or something like that. There's this thing where both the crowd in general, but also religious people can turn. I mean, we look at the dichotomies that we have in our own country right now. We have people who name themselves as Christians,
Yeah.
but I would, and I'm speaking for myself, I would be pushed to say that I don't see any love there or any of the teachings or living or following Jesus. It seems much more in line with the Pharisees, but they use Jesus to justify their ignorance. You know, and so the very thing that Jesus was saying not to do, we do sometimes. Now,
But it's two different factions.
yeah, but we do know that on that day, because of the religious, it says, when you get reading into the whole Passion, they went and conspired to say, ask for Barabbas, ask for Barabbas. And all of some of these people who were kind of really on Jesus' side, they felt pressured. Some of these people weren't the same people, but it's kind of clear that these are some of the same people. Now it's interesting. If you notice, it's pretty quiet about what the disciples are doing at the crucifixion. What we know is they all run, except for John, the one who writes this, the really strong, detailed
And Peter
Passion.
was I think Peter and John were kind of hanging together because John's the one
John-
who got Peter into the.
John, but Peter was gone, because Peter was over there at that thing, and where he had, during that whole episode, he's denying Jesus.
Right, but John's the one that got him in there. John's the one that got him access.
Yeah, he came into the courtyard of the military thing. Yeah, so, I mean, Peter's going along at this point, but once it's put on the line, so it's actually, we want to say it's two crowds, but here it's not. His closest of followers, except for, from what we understand, John and Mary Magdalene, that all flee.
Right.
Peter, who's supposed to be the head of the disciples, denies he even knows the man.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to hear, but it's the truth.
But you know, another way I kind of look at that is Jesus basically told him to do so or commanded him to do so in the prophecy that you will deny me 3 times. Or twice or whatever it was.
Yeah.
And it was the same thing with Judas, because Jesus said to him, go and do what you're going to do quickly. And I'm like, the poor guy he was screwfig-noogin because he had a role that he had to play, and he followed through with what Jesus told him, go and do what you're going to do quickly. And he carried through that, and it was essential for what Jesus knew had to happen, that he was going to get crucified, unlike what Peter wanted to happen. No, we're going to stand up and defend him.
Yeah. But I think with Judas, and I think people also, it's this sometimes in this tradition of, like, there's this one place in the world, where is it? It's somewhere in Central or South America. There's this one place that on Saturday, in between Good Friday and thing, they burn all these effigies of Judas.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and it's like, I'm like going, I don't think Jesus, because no, remember, Jesus gave him communion even though he knew he was going to betray him.
Yeah.
You know, he gave him the cup. Now, here's the thing, my take on some of that. When it comes to Judas and Peter and all of them who had their roles, they did have a role in this. In the end, I believe it was completely their choice. Now, that doesn't mean that they weren't misled or, and the thing about it is they're human, and you know what? We screw up and do some stuff like that we greatly regret later. Judas, it seems, you know, a lot of people are really cruel, but it sounds like with Judas, he really loved Jesus. And he really wanted to happen. And I think he was so heartbroken that Jesus wasn't going to be the Messiah he wanted him to be. That when Jesus says, you know, Jesus wasn't stupid, obviously, and the disciples, I mean, it wasn't like, he could tell there's something going on with Judas.
Sure.
And he has a sense, I think he's really going to betray me.
Yeah.
So I think what he does, and when he says this, he says, got to do it quickly, is also showing Jesus as though anxiety as a human part of saying, I can't endure this.
Yeah.
Just get this over with. Get this over with, because Jesus is suffering through this. But he loves Judas through it. He knows Judas is going to betray him. And I think, you know, Judas then obviously realizes after he did what he did, he goes, what did I do? He thought this was going to get Jesus to change his mind. He thought it was going to work out different. And then when all of a sudden they're leading him into Pontius Pilate, I mean, he goes and he hangs himself.
Well,
He's so despondent.
Because he did everything he could to repent. He went back, he took back his statement against Jesus to the Pharisees. He said, this man is innocent. And he gave back the money, and they wouldn't accept it. And
I have a sense of compassion for Judas. And I believe Jesus welcomed him into paradise. Because he welcomes us.
Too, because there are other places where Jesus said, the 12 who were with me during my ministry will be the judges of Israel. And yet, you read the gospel, or after the gospels, and Peter and others have very unkind things to say about Judas.
Yeah, and Peter's not really one to talk, I think. Peter's very impetuous.
Yeah.
I mean, God love him, but, you know, he's one of those ones like, in every parish community, you got characters.
Yeah.
Peter's one of those ones you're like, oh, bless his little heart. Jesus. Help. It's like, what's he going to do next, But, because Peter does this, denies Jesus, and Jesus, as soon as he sees, at the resurrection, he doesn't come in and go, you betrayed me, you're evil, and you must be no. He's there with them. It says, peace be with you. Every time he comes in, peace be with you. And this whole thing is much, if we contemplate the whole passion narrative as it goes, it's much deeper than just like some people yelling, get rid of him and all this. There's a lot going on here. And in a sense, that's Palm Passion Sunday kind of forces you to deal with some of that, although we probably don't talk about it like we're doing right now enough.
But the other thing that gives me hope that it wasn't, the whole community of Jerusalem, which I don't know what the population was at that time, but where they were holding those, crucify him, him, that wasn't that big of a space. There were probably only 1,000, maybe 2,000 people in there, whereas in the entire city that was out worshiping him the day before, there were probably many thousands of people.
It could be. That's really hard to know.
So,
Yeah.
So I just keep hoping that's why I've never held the Jews accountable. I've held the people accountable who carried it out, most of which were Jewish. But I don't see it.
Of course, they would be, because there wouldn't be any other. Non-Jews wouldn't be interested in the whole thing. So.
Well, for a while, it was the Romans technically were the ones.
Well, see, I think, and people always blame Pontius Pilate a lot. Pontius Pilate, according to what we have, did not want to go with this.
He did everything he could.
He tried to, he came out and said, I find nothing wrong with it. I mean, this is not like a lot of Roman.
I wash my hands of this.
Which, of course, begs the question, though, since the historical record shows that Pontius Pilate was kind of a bloodthirsty maniac when he was in charge. The idea that he would be so reluctant to kill somebody that just to please a crowd seems unlikely. So it's possible the narrative's been edited by someone who's trying to make
There's also
sense.
that, remember there's that part in there we don't hear a lot about his wife comes to him and she has this dream and she said, don't you do it. Don't have anything to do with it. And I think he's scared.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's on different levels. I think he's scared in a way of like, I'm being put into something I do not want to be a part of. And then he also wants to avoid civil disruption.
Yeah.
There's, I mean, even if he's this mean guy, which he probably was, there's something that tells him, let's not try to push this. And I mean, now he does give in, and he says, just, okay, do it.
That's why I've always wondered why the Nicene Creed specifically names him, because it really wasn't him, it was the Jewish leader.
Well, it says crucified under Pontius, meaning under his authority.
Okay.
Doesn't mean he did it.
But I'm like, it was the Pharisees who caused the whole thing.
Yeah, and some Sadducees and
Certain Pharisees.
some other groups too. Yeah, there was a lot of, also if you kind of study and go back in that period, there was a lot of political jockeying among both other religious groups and non-religious groups. I mean, the Essenes had their eye on Jesus and was really hoping he was going to be one of them, so.
Isn't there something about the cock crows too of this?
Yeah, that's with Peter, with the, when he denies Jesus. And, the whole scene at the cross is, I'm sorry, we've kind of gotten off the liturgy part here. But that's okay. That's okay. If we want to talk, we do what we want. His mother's there, and you got Mary Magdalene, who's just always the faithful one. In some ways, she's kind of like the hero of the early church, really. She really is.
The apostle to the apostles.
Yeah, she's like the bishop to the disciples. So she's the one that always seems to get it, and so she's there, and then John. And, they all flee. And so the whole thing about, we have this nice thing about this is, and then later they were in the upper room, and we picture like it's some nice lounge somewhere. No, this upper room was a hiding place, so they wouldn't get caught and crucified. They were scared to death. They thought, they had no expectation of Jesus rising from the dead. They thought this was over and we're next. And, and then, and it's interesting, it's the women who are at the tomb, not the men. And then they come dragging them. And then it's interesting, they go back, the men go back and say, oh, this is what she said. And they're like, and nothing happens. Well, the woman told us, they're all hysterical anyway, They just imagined all this.
So I'm thinking they're thinking the body was stolen.
Yeah, and so they're thinking that, and of course, what they try to, of course, there's a story that goes on where they tell Pontius Pilate and stuff, we want to be said that his body was stolen. Don't listen to these people, There's a lot of stuff happening in all this. So when we begin Holy Week, we kind of begin with that. And then the other big days of what's called the Triduum, the meaning basically the special 3 days. And meaning, when you say the Triduum, it's considered actually one event, but it's broken up over 3 days. You have Maundy, Thursday, Maundy meaning command. So here he is the evening before he's crucified. He gathers his disciples, all of them. And he's doing this intensive teaching, and in the midst of that, he talks about you must be willing to serve one another, and all of this he goes into. And he gets this thing, and of course, which is very common. They would always have washed their feet when coming inside and doing things. So Jesus washes their feet, which was also very common to have a house servant to come and do that. So he's reversing the roles, being the servant. And of course, they don't like it. And we still don't like it today. I mean, it's so odd for us when, I know some people who avoid Maundy, Thursday like the plague. I mean, they're like, I ain't letting anybody wash my feet. And I remember this guy, I gave him gun. I had one parishioner. He had the ugliest feet in the world. I mean, the ugliest I've ever seen. And he was like, stuck him out. Go ahead, Jason. And I was like, go with gusto if you're going to do it. So you've got this thing where he does this whole thing of washing their feet, this teaching. And then after that, they come to the table and sit there. And that's when here at this table, so much is happening. And which he institutes what we would call the Eucharist, our communion. And then after that, and you see what we do, Maundy, Thursday service this year, by the way, I don't know for sure what all to tell you, because it's going to be at the Presbyterian Church, and I know it's going to be fun. I'm looking forward to it. But I know they have some things we kind of live into and act out. I do know that there will be foot washing, and there's going to be some form of communion, which is great. And I think they're doing communion before and then the foot washing, I think. So, but it'll all work out. It's still participating and telling that story. Now, what we would normally do is after that service, at the end, we know that after that, Jesus goes to the garden and he's in great anguish and pain. He's wrestling and saying, is there any way I don't have to do this, please? And he pleads for his disciples to stay with him. And they're already sloughing off, I mean, it says, he's sweating blood. And so they go, and it then becomes a very quiet and lonely place. So what we do at the end of the service, after we've received that communion, we then go to that startness, and we normally do the stripping of the altar and everything, and we remove everything. Say, okay, we're heading into the long stretch here, and you take it all away, and it's barren. And in quietness, we do the final prayers, and we go forth and prepare for what's to come. Now, once we do that, though, and for us, because we're sacramental, we take the consecrated bread and wine from that Maundy, Thursday Eucharist, and we will take it and then put it on what we call an altar of repose, a place of rest. It's with like just maybe one flower, and you bring the candle, the symbol of the light, that it's there, presence of Christ is there, and you set it to the side, not in the front, and people will, remember he asked his disciple, will you stay awake with me? Will you watch with me through the night? And what we do is we say, we're going to try to do what the disciples wouldn't do. And so we bring that presence of Christ himself right there, and chairs and a focus. And through the night we sit and we just contemplate and think about, this is the night, what he went through. And it was still dark when they come with their clubs and all that and come to get him. So what happens is that's done until, the watch is usually done until you start your Good Friday service, or sometimes people will do at sunrise. So, and for us then, the Good Friday liturgy, again, is so stark. And I have to admit, it's very hard for me to get through every time I do it. I mean, even emotionally, I'm one of those ones that can't always block my emotion that I'm feeling in worship. And I've done it for years, but there's something when you all walk through the Good Friday thing. And what we do is not all people do this, but this has been something I've carried on, and it's part of, it says in the service, it's optional. I do this, is at the very end of that service, I go in quietness and somebody grabs the candle, and I grab the sacrament from the night before, and we bring it up and set it simply on the altar. And we say, even in the midst of this, of darkness, the light shines, waiting to break through. And Christ is even present to us in his own death and suffering. And so we gather at the altar quietly, and we just say the prayer he taught us. We say the Lord's Prayer, and we give communion to you, saying, even right now, Christ is here for you. And we give the communion, and as soon as everybody receives, I will go to where the candle is lit and do just a final blow it out, and say, "It is finished." And we leave in silence. And, there isn't, I have to admit that now, I'm going to show my personal prayer. Oh Lord, I went to a ecumenical Good Friday service in Missouri, and it was like a talent show.
Oh, wow.
The Lutheran pastor, you're Lutheran, you should know better. He's wearing his white alb and his Alleluia stole. And I'm like, wait a minute. We're not there yet. This is Good Friday. And he's playing his guitar and everybody's clapping. And I'm like, wait a minute. It just was very awkward, So I think that, it's hard, but we leave it in quiet and starkness. But then we prepare because, of course, then you can either go to Easter Sunday morning, or what we also do is the Easter Vigil. And if anybody wants, remember how I told you on the Easter Vigil, they would go down into the font, usually in the courtyard of the church, and a lot of times they were carved in the shape of a cross, the bed where they would walk down into, and they would turn their back to the west for the darkness, and as the sun rises, they would go into the baptismal waters and come up facing the east for the rising of the sun as a symbol of the resurrection. And here's one right here. Okay. Here is a picture this is in Jordan, I think. And this is in an ancient church that they've excavated. Mm-hmm. And there's one of the baptismal fonts. That was what we would do at the Easter Vigil. So there's the floor. Oh yeah. And so they would step in here, and they'd stand in the middle, and then they would go down into the water. And so east would be this way, west would be this way.
Wow.
And so
Wow.
I just happened to see that on a thing posted this week.
Wow.
And if anybody's watching, voila. So,
wow.
The Easter Vigil recounts, what it does is it recounts basically the history of salvation, or what we call just salvation history. You hear God's promises from the very beginning in the Old Covenant of saying, I'm with you, it's not going to be forsaken. You face this, you face this, you face this, but I am the God who promises. I'm the one who keeps the covenant. So you hear this story, and it starts in darkness. And then you light the fire. And that's what the early Christians, so, after the candles are put out and everything, on Good Friday and stuff, it's dark, death. And what we do is we light that fire, the first light to start breaking the darkness. And the Paschal candle, and Paschal means Passover, that passing over from death into life. And so you take that large candle, and it is lit from the first fire. And either a deacon or somebody, and this is a very ancient liturgy. The deacon will sing the exultet, basically singing, God is breaking through right now for us. And sometimes sometimes the waters of all this symbol of death and life, sometimes I'll take the Paschal candle and bless the first waters, and they'll take it and actually sit it into the font and bless the waters with the new light. And so you have this liturgy then that then leads you, and as you get towards the thing of the resurrection, a few more candles are lit. A few more are lit. A few more. And then when the big proclamation of the first Alleluia, he is risen, it's usually common, I don't know if y'all have done this here, everybody bring bells. I don't know, have y'all done that?
We haven't done that.
Usually at the thing, it's like, and of course kids love this. The only thing is try and get them not to ring them before. But I remember in our seminary, we had this thing, we're walking through this, and then, boy, when the Alleluia came, all the lights came on, all the candles were lit, and the organ's just shaking the room, and people, and of course it was Wisconsin, so we had cowbells. And I did, and we're bang, 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 and the church bells will ring out to pierce the darkness. And it's just this, whoo, you're moving into and what was usually done at that service, those who had gone through Lent and were preparing to be baptized, to be part of the full community, then, because that service back then was even longer. I mean, they started pretty late at night. I mean, probably like 2 a.m. And then it would end as the sun was coming out, as they would go out to the font. And after they would baptize these new believers, they would then celebrate the Eucharist. So that's one of your Easter services, and of course it's a transition. And of course then of Easter Day, the morning, we all know that. I mean, it's just Alleluia, 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 and lots of Easter lily smell. And there's all of that, and to be a great celebration, and so for us, the day of the resurrection, all of us go through our own journey, as I meant, about like our walk with what we really believe. Some people say, well, I kind of get that Jesus has died. I just don't understand this resurrection thing. And I'm like, well, of course, it hadn't happened to any of us, so of course you kind of wonder. But for us, you can't have Easter without the cross. But you can't just have the cross. You have to have the resurrection. Or there's that place where the Apostle Paul says, if this is not true, we are of all people to be pitied. And I think that is such an honest statement. Now, we don't understand. I mean, we weren't there. We didn't see it. But we do know that, and we're going to end here because I know I'm going too late. Easter is not just a day. There's what we call the Easter season because we know the way it's told in Scripture. There's all these, and people just kind of get to Easter Day and they don't read some of the rest. All these appearances of Jesus, and they're all really different. If as we get ready for it, watch for this. All these experiences of how they experienced the Jesus resurrected are all very different. The people on the road to Emmaus, you're kind of going, well, what's wrong with you guys? And they're going like that when that's incredible. So it says he broke the bread when he was sitting with them, and they're going, oh, it's Jesus. And I'm like going, what, you weren't looking up before then? I mean, what, But it's in that action that it comes clear, and I love the whole story of the road to Emmaus, because even later then they say, weren't your hearts burning within you when he was teaching us on the road? It's this incredible story, and then there's almost the ones that's kind of like, well, that's not a big deal, but they put it in there, Peter's out there fishing, they're all doing this kind of grimy, and I think it says he was naked in the boat and everything. So he's full commando, and he's like coming to the shore, and Jesus is just sitting there waiting for him with the fire, cooking some fish. And I'm like, I love that these stories are not all like, Jesus came on a cloud, and the trumpets blared, and blah, blah, blah. They're really earthy. He comes to them in those ways. So I'm talking about Easter now. So I need to stop. But, it's just live the story, let it just happen for you, I hope. And sometimes there's parts of the liturgy may speak to you and sometimes it won't. And that's okay. You take what you get. Thank you. I'm sorry I kept you so long.
Will there be one next Sunday too?
Or
maybe not.
I think for Palm Sunday, usually